All right, welcome back, everybody. We are at week 4. We're already over halfway through the course. I hope you're finding it good and helpful and insightful. And yeah, I think this week we're going to start to dig into some other stuff. This week will be actually a little bit lighter. I feel like I promise that every week, but this week it actually will be. This week we're going to talk about recommendation systems. I was looking to see if there was like a no-code option to sort of learn how to train your own recommendation system, and unfortunately I couldn't really find one. We also don't have a designer lined up for an interview this week. I will hit 6 designers in total. We won't have one for this exact week, and maybe we will in the future to cover that. So yeah, just sort of going through recommendation systems a little bit. And recommendation systems are kind of funny. Like, it might not seem like it really fits into this class. This is probably the only thing that I'm covering that is really like clearly like shallow AI. But I actually think it's really important to think about it, because for a lot of companies, this is your first step into quote unquote AI or machine learning or data science, because recommendation systems are kind of a must have for a lot of different tools. Obviously, like, most of us have used a recommendation system in the past. All the big players have them, and they've all sort of like worked on their own versions of them. And we'll talk a little about those details today. Obviously, if you use Spotify, Netflix, Amazon, YouTube, pretty much every social media tool, you've dealt with recommendation systems, or maybe quote unquote the algorithm. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well later today. So what are recommendation systems? So when we talk about a recommendation system, obviously it's a way to recommend content, products, items, videos, whatever you want to call it, to users. But there are a number of reasons why you would actually want to work on recommendation systems beyond just like sort of recommending a new thing. So obviously, like, the reason we have these tools, a lot of these platforms, especially these big ones, have too much content. It is like impossible for any one user to go and find everything they want going through these platforms, right? So trying to find the perfect Amazon product is, a needle in a haystack. There are so many products. YouTube especially, like, there's more content uploaded than is literally watchable by most people on the planet. So, it's about finding content similar to what you already like, right? And this is sort of a key component. It's like, what I've already liked on the site, I want recommended more of that to me. And we'll talk about how that's both good and bad in this recording. Obviously, from the business side, there's a lot of valuable reasons for why you'd want to do this, right? The clear goal here is to increase retention, right? Keep people on YouTube, keep people in Spotify, or in the case of a place where you're selling products, like higher conversion rate. If we can recommend the better product to you, you don't have to spend a lot of time looking for stuff, searching for stuff. You are likely to stay on our site and buy from us. Another key component here, especially in content like Spotify, YouTube, whatever, a lot of social media, is that manual curation is quite expensive, right? Humans cost a lot of money. And to work at the scale you need to work at across these platforms, it becomes really expensive. And I don't want to pass up this, because I think this is, one of the ethical problems of these tools is that they do in many ways eliminate the jobs that would have previously been held by individual curators, people who are experts and might be able to recommend things. And I would say, like, there's probably a loss of expertise on some of these tools. But going forward, like, that is kind of what we're seeing here. And you do see some sites sort of push back against that or focus on curation. I mean, Spotify is an interesting one in that it sort of works on both sides. But a lot of platforms do look at this as a way to cut costs. I would also say, just like at the end, like, there's a competitive advantage to this. If your recommendation system works better than other people's does, people are going to use you as the product. And in fact, Netflix in, I think, 2007 or 2008 made what was called the Netflix Prize. And it was basically $1 million award to any data science team that could improve their own internal Netflix recommendation system by more than 10%. There's actually a great article here about sort of like the history of this process and like what different players were doing and what they weren't doing, if you want to go read that. But even in 2008, 2009, I recognize that this is starting to feel old. Like, this is like old tech at this point. But the idea that they could make a better system for Netflix was so important to this company that they were going to spend $1 million on it. Now they had, I don't know how many teams working on it. So, in terms of cost over the amount of people working on it, was probably pretty cheap, actually. And I mean, this is why reward systems are never that good, or these like massive $1 million contests are kind of still contests. So, the winners do well, the losers don't. But anyway, I think it's important to highlight that, like, one, these tools have been around for a while. I think I read that Amazon first started their recommendation system in 1998. Netflix, obviously, this was big during the late 2000s. They had a whole system of like categorization amongst other things. So it does feel a little bit like old tech, but we are seeing companies sort of come back and revisit them and improve them. And we'll talk even at the end of this video about like sort of the future of these systems and how generative AI might actually be influencing them going forward. But the number one tool, or like the class of tools that people talk about when they talk about recommendation systems, is usually called collaborative filtering. And it is a set of algorithms. It is not like one algorithm that you can apply, whatever. You usually have to like experiment with different types of algorithms. And the goal of them is obviously to recommend content or products based on the similarity to other users or other items. And these two sort of concepts around users and items is something we'll cover now. So there's this really funny Wikipedia GIF, which honestly I could not. It's very hard to explain what's actually happening here. Like I get it now that I've watched it, but it's flies by so quickly that it's kind of funny. So let's talk a little bit about user-to-user collaborative filtering. For me, the easiest way to explain this is, let's say there's 3 users, and those 3 users all have purchased different items. So user number 1 has purchased items 1, 3, 5, and 7, and user 2 has purchased items 2, 4, 6, and 8. And then there's a third user who has bought 1, 5, and 7. And obviously, like in this very small toy use case, it's pretty easy to see what we would recommend next to user 3, right? We would say, well, user 1 and user 3 are pretty similar in that they've bought 3 of the same products. So let's recommend number 3 to them because they're very similar. Now, obviously, in a real world example, this is much more massive. It's much crazier. You don't have clear matches between different customers, but the idea is to find the most similar customer base to you and to sort of develop cohorts, which you then might recommend products based on that. That is called user-to-user collaborative filtering. That's very common. The other really common example is item-to-item. And the difference here is actually that we sort of invert the order. So it's more about items, and then it's finding the users that like them or whatever. So let's say we've got 3 different videos. Users 2, 4, 5, and 6 have both liked this video. For video 2, it's users 1, 3, 7, and 8. And then again, in this toy example, we have we have a video number 3 that was liked by users 3, 7, and 8. So we would probably recommend to user 1 video 3, right? So we would say, hey, user 1, like check out this video because other users have liked it. If it's a little confusing about like what the difference is here, because we're both talking about users and we're both talking about items, I think this next diagram kind of helps, which is that this is actually from a white paper on the difference between these two models. It's linked to here if you're interested in it. But you'll see on the left here, this is a user-to-user model. And I think what's important are actually these outside arrows. What we're actually doing is we're saying user 1 and 3 are correlated to each other. And therefore, anything that happens for user 1, we can also recommend to user 3. Whereas in the item-to-item example, we're actually correlating items to each other. So we're saying these items are related, and that's because of different users and how they appreciate them. But you actually could like kind of do one or the other. In reality, what actually happens is like most collaborating systems combine both using other technical processes and other things. So they actually kind of look at both of these and they say like, well, okay, let's weight both of these evenly and see if there's any really strong overlaps to make the best item recommendation. Because at the end of the day, we are recommending items. We're not recommending other users. I guess unless a user is an item, which might be what Facebook does. But anyway, like most of the time we're going to recommend items, whether that be video, songs, products to buy, whatever. But as I mentioned, often these tools include other systems. Maybe back in like the early, aughts or whatever, like we would have been sufficient to use just those 2 systems. Now we have way more tools available to us and a lot more of other model systems and that sort of thing. So this is a diagram I found from 2021. The other challenge is like, I'm sure these are being updated today now that we've got generative AI and other things. But in 2021, there was a paper written about how YouTube's recommendation system works. And I don't know that we need to like go too deep into this, but suffice to say, like, there is a lot more going on here than just those recommendation systems that we talked about. There is also stuff like what's called video features, which would be like scraping data about the video. When was it last uploaded? What is the title of the video? Like, what is the content? What's in the description? Now there's even systems to go through and actually like pull out and extract the content within the video, like what people are saying, maybe doing some color extraction or visual extraction. And those are now built into their system as well. So in addition to sort of all the user history and context, and this is probably where that more user to user, item to item stuff exists. There's also a lot of other things that are now being pumped in to create sort of a weighted algorithm. And these weighted systems, obviously it's at a place like YouTube, like that is probably where like a majority of their engineering goes to in terms of like product, because for YouTube it's really about making sure that people stay on the site and watch as many videos as possible. And believe me, we'll talk about the ethical issues of that going forward, but there's a lot more built into this. And likewise, if you go and search like how does Spotify's algorithm work, you find some crazy diagrams. One thing I'll mention is that I've heard a lot of that what Spotify actually does is they also scrape web pages. So they might be scraping, say, various music blogs and finding out that music blogs, like maybe one particular writer is talking about the best rap albums, and they're actually going through and figuring out what rap albums are related to each other. There's also, a bunch of content that's uploaded by the record labels or by these platform services around, who was the producer of this record? When was this record produced? Like what, like even audio analysis stuff where it even goes in and says, oh, what does this sound like? What is the sonic tone of these things? What's the beat? What's the BPM? And that all gets filled into Spotify in addition to these sort of collaborative systems. Now, the collaborative systems tend to have the most weight because they're real user data, but it doesn't always mean that it's the only thing that goes into it, right? And there's obviously a feedback loop here. Likewise, there's all these other things around play logs and, again, a lot of stuff being pulled from news posts, blogs, text. I know for a while, I don't know about the most recent layoffs, but I know Spotify had their own editors that would actually like also make playlists, and they would probably use that data to also inform these machine learning tools going forward. So suffice to say, like, there's a lot going on in these systems these days, and as a UX person, you might care less about this and more about what's actually happening on the front end, but it's probably helpful to at least understand what's going on behind the scenes, because it helps you error correct, or maybe you even want to do something that is more transparent, like why am I being recommended this product? And we'll look at some stuff like that in a minute too. If you are interested in Spotify, a lot has been written about the various Spotify algorithms. I did find this article from 2022, which is fairly recent, that I thought went really deep into this. And obviously, like, this isn't a Spotify tutorial, so I'm not going to cover that, but there's a lot more in here if you're really interested in learning more. So I would definitely recommend checking out some of these articles if you're interested in sort of seeing all the various ways that we can pull out data from different content types and be able to build off that. So as a UX person, I think there are some considerations to think about with recommendation systems. Customers have become pretty used to these things, and I think there's certain behaviors that are expected now. So first off, like the first thing you might need to think about as a product designer is like, most of this is based on modeled existing user behavior, right? So I have, logged into YouTube. I've, liked a bunch of videos. I've added some stuff to playlists. But let's say, someone else comes in and has never used YouTube before and is literally maybe not even logged in yet. How do you show content to that person? And there's been lots of different ways to do this, right? You might just pull like the top 50 best videos across your entire platform and show those. You might have, some sort of system on the website that allows for filtering. Say I want, this type of music, or I want this type of video, or maybe you take the first search results from them and begin to build a recommendation system off that. So with a lot of these systems, there are ways to begin to grab like initial content, but at some point you do want that customer to be liking stuff, logged in, that sort of thing. So it's important to think about what that first time use case is, that logged out user, especially for these systems, because you do need some fallback when you don't have enough data for them. This is often what we called cold starts, which again I would just say is a logged out user or a first time user. The feedback loop. So what feedback are we actually gathering from our customers and our users to make these assumptions? And this usually breaks down into a couple different things. So first off, there's what we would call explicit feedback. This would be something where the customer literally says, I like this and I want more of it. That could be a purchase, that could be a like, that could be a favorite, that could be a retweet, whatever. Then there is stuff that's implicit feedback, which is a little shakier in the sense that you have to sort of infer from some behaviors. I think a common one that maybe we'll talk about in just a second is watch time. Like YouTube obviously cares how far along in the video you watched, but that has some potential issues, or like that's not a clear explicitly stated feedback from a user that I like this because I watched all of it, or I didn't like it because I didn't watch all of it. So have to take that into consideration. So obviously explicit feedback, like most websites you go to have some form of explicit feedback on them, especially the big platforms, right? On YouTube, it's that thumbs up button. That's why everyone begs you for a thumbs up. But there are other tools, right? You could share something, you could download it, you could save it to a playlist, you could subscribe to that channel. Like there are other explicit feedback that says, I as a user had a positive experience with this. Obviously with, with X, Twitter, like likes, retweets, quote tweets, whatever, bookmarks, all of that feeds into their algorithm. And it's actually why some people say like, well, if you don't like this person, don't retweet their stuff, because that might improve their algorithmic standing. There are other things like wish lists and playlists that are also explicit. I mean, I think you could probably make a good case that, any song I add on Spotify to a playlist is me saying I like this song. Most users aren't going and saying like worst songs of 2020 and like putting songs in there. Likewise, a wish list might be something you're not buying today, but you have a future intent to buy it. And a lot of these things go into like weighted algorithms, right? So it's not like all of these things are seen as like a one-to-one. Like liking a video is not the same as adding a video to a playlist if you haven't watched it yet, right? But it could be inferred from this that there's some positive correlation. On the other side, we have implicit, and implicit stuff is often like watch time. So when I upload a video to YouTube or when I upload a video to Vimeo, I probably should be doing more of this. I don't really, to be honest, but watch time. So how soon am I losing customers? You'll see this video that I posted isn't doing particularly well compared to the average. So typical retention is, you do lose a lot of people immediately, but from there you should keep a lot of users going through the entire video. Whereas I have pretty much clearly like tanked pretty far along. It happens, whatever. Likewise, Vimeo has a similar sort of viewing tool. Is this good? Is this bad? I mean, again, I think you make the argument that watch time isn't always correlated to a positive experience, right? If I leave a video, it might be because, I got distracted, or like I had to go leave to do something else and I want to come back to it, but maybe I just forgot about it. Or I want to come back to it and maybe I will in 2 weeks or a month. So, these implicit feedbacks definitely shouldn't be taken as strongly as explicit feedback, but there is some use of that data in these systems. That's often because most customers don't even have that much data, so we have to pull out implied data to sort of make a case for what user group they fall into or what items we should recommend. The reality is most customers do not spend all day every day on our site, and we have to find ways around that to make the best case or make the most use of the data they give us. One of the things I also think you'll see on these platforms, especially the bigger ones, is there will be a place in your settings or whatever to actually say like, do not use this against my recommendations, or do use this. So on the left-hand side here is Amazon. I buy a lot of shit from Amazon, sorry. You can go in and you can say like, hey, the furniture rises I bought were really like a one-time thing. I don't really want to like see that encouraged in my user recommendations, or maybe I really hated this particular movie and I don't want to see any recommendation based on it. You can opt out of these. Likewise, today was the first time I've ever really looked at my Twitter settings, and I found that it really thinks I like cryptocurrencies, when actually most of my response about crypto is like about how bad it is. Again, is that an interest because I talk about it a lot? Maybe. I would prefer the model didn't think that I was pro crypto, but also like on the other side, maybe it's good that it thinks that, so I get bad recommendations. There is a world of thought where like bad recommendations are good, right? You don't want the model to necessarily know you completely. Maybe you don't like the platform and you want to see them lose money, so therefore you have them show you bad ads. You can just block people or whatever. Not saying I do that, but just saying it's pretty clear when I look through all the interests that X has put on for me, like most of them are bad, or most of them are stuff I don't even know about. I must have liked some post about this actress at some point and it just said, now you like that. And I was like, what? So I don't know how many people actually use these things. I don't think this should be a prioritized experience for most designers, but I do think it's good to know that it exists. And it's good, especially if you're a major platform, to have a way that I can say I want to opt out of it. I do think that's a nice experience for most designers, for most customers, but again, the amount of people that actually visit these pages versus other things, probably low priority, but it's good to have. Other recommendations for recommendation systems, God, that's terrible. Considerations for recommendation systems. I would describe it as like context. This would be like what I've referred to before as the socks problem. This happens to be, at one time, it was my most favorited tweet, which is kind of embarrassing. But I'm sure many of us have had this experience in Amazon where we buy something, say we buy socks, and then all of our recommendations for the next couple of days are more socks. And you're like, I just bought socks. Why do I want more socks? And as some people who responded to me sort of rightly pointed out, like, socks aren't that bad because they're cheap, and you might actually want to buy more of them. It's actually worse when you buy a refrigerator and you get another refrigerator, because most customers are not going to buy 2 refrigerators in the same session or even in the same year. This is what I would describe as a context problem. And I don't know that there's actually a good way to solve this within recommendation systems. So the solution might actually be that you need to add an additional layer to sort of solve for context, meaning, hey, someone just bought this, don't show them more of it. But maybe also the model is saying, actually, it's very likely that customers will buy this again right after this thing. So you have to kind of figure that out. The other thing I think is funny is I do think some of these models are beginning to use natural language processing, or, maybe more user-to-user data. So for example, just this week I was buying what's called a dry box for my camera equipment to keep from mold from growing on it. But either I or the other users must have also clicked on a dry box for like drying steak or drying meats. So now most of my recommendations are like, yeah, there's a one camera or like one lens, but there's also a bunch of like charcuterie or meats, which are very funny because I'm vegetarian. Like there's zero chance I will ever buy any of these. But again, the model, maybe because of natural language processing, maybe pulled out dry cabinet and said, oh, dry cabinets are related to aging meat or, curing meat. Or maybe, a user before me was actually looking for these meat curing things, these boxes or whatever, but also clicked it on a camera one that I looked at, and therefore now we're correlated to each other. This is kind of the downside of recommendation systems, right? If you get them wrong, you can look kind of like a fool to your users. Most users are probably used to this on Amazon or just like whatever, and I'll buy a couple other things over the next month on Amazon and my recommendations will be very different. But I do think you find some very, very funny moments in these experiences, and it's worth thinking about as a designer if you want to try to solve for these in a better way. Maybe you could, maybe you can't. How much does this actually affect your user and their conversion rate or their retention rate? It's worth thinking about, but again, it's probably low priority compared to other things like actually improving your model to make sure it's doing the highest conversion. Like maybe I didn't actually buy a lens box, so maybe I want to actually get it again to get a new one. So I think it's just worth considering. Okay, and lastly, we want to talk about how frequently do we update the recommendations, right? And this is often a comparison with engineering, because engineers are like, this is going to be really expensive every time we have to retrain the model with new user data, that sort of thing. So I actually don't have a lot of recommendations here. Your engineering team probably has some understanding of how to do this and like what is the right amount or how frequently to do it, right? There's something to say that like you don't need to do it every time a user does something new, because you can leverage existing historical data, but how often are you pushing new products out? Like then you might need to be looking at a new model. And that's where some of these intermediary steps of like looking at the content, right? Extracting content recommendations, or looking at when this was released, what producer is it, what style is it, what artist is it, and being able to make recommendations based on that data rather than purely on the individual song or the individual video itself. And that's always a balance. It's just a balance of trying to figure out like, when's the right time? When is there so much new data we need to train the model again? But there is always a cost associated with training these models as well. Okay, now there are a lot of ethical problems to these recommendation systems, so let's talk about some of them. Obviously, we won't go through all of them, but I think most of us probably are aware of at least some of them with these models. So first, let's talk about a little bit about YouTube. YouTube is like well known for having lots of ethical issues with their recommendation system. In 2017, James Bridle wrote this really, really great piece. I definitely recommend you go and read it if you haven't already, which is it's called Something is Wrong on the Internet. And it's more or less actually about all the like kids videos that get uploaded to YouTube, and how there's clearly like some automated systems at play. So like no one actually makes these videos, they're automated, and they get more and more disturbing the further away you get from sort of, the first couple videos you watch. YouTube's system by default sort of auto plays. And I've heard lots of people sort of say, like, if you leave it running overnight, by the end you'll get like the most fucked up video you've ever seen in your life, like really dark conservative videos or other things. And that is a problem with this algorithm, and it's well known within YouTube. All the way back in 2016, a engineer at YouTube actually said that like the YouTube algorithm was pushing people toward Donald Trump. Why? Wasn't really sure, but like there's a lot of recommendation systems that are pushing toward fake news. So that might be that, like, again, these algorithms are hackable in the sense that if you get lots of people to recommend an individual video, like that might spike it and it might push that video to other people. There was a really great New York Times piece, I forget exactly when this was, maybe around the same time, 2016, 2017, about a particular person who was more or less, turned into a conservative by YouTube because YouTube kept recommending all these videos to him. And the further and further he got down in the rabbit hole, he sort of like went all in on this stuff. And then at some point realized that it was crazy, and he started watching other videos and was like, wait, what's been going on here? So YouTube, well known for having these problems, and it's a clear, more or less a problem with the algorithm. And again, it may be that conservative people are more likely to like and subscribe and do all the right things to promote videos versus others. Who's to say for sure? And I think this is again where the question becomes, should you let the algorithm do its own thing by itself completely, or do you need to have humans in the loop and begin to interject into those models, like to say like, hey, something is going wrong here, we need to add another layer of protection or another layer of security. This is basically like the most common AI question, right? Which is like, do you just let the model do its own thing and like you just let it go, or do you need to go in and step in and make some changes there? I think we're also in this world where we basically have incentivized people to go along with the algorithm, right? And this leads to this world where people on TikTok, people on Instagram are saying like, here's how you quote unquote hack the algorithm, right? The algorithm has certain things it prefers. It means that if you really want to go viral or whatever, you need to have all of your supporters go and like the video in the first 5 minutes that it goes up, right? Like that sort of hacks the algorithm. Or, make sure you're talking about trendy things, or make sure you're using the right keywords in your video descriptions, those sort of things. It's even gone so far as like the influencer program on Instagram has even released videos that like, hey, we actually have multiple algorithms. You want to make sure you optimize for each algorithm. And it's like, we're getting to this place where people are making content more to support the algorithm than they are to make content for their users. And this leads to this crazy rabbit hole of like, people talking about trendy topics that might actually be quite like bad, right? I know that on TikTok, where I'm not like that active of a user, I know people tend to go down these rabbit holes of like, murder stories or other things because it's what the algorithm picks up on as being attractive. And we're led to this problem of like basically that people are now making content for the algorithm and not making content for users. And you could argue like, well, that's people just trying to make money. Or you could argue like we're down a really bad path here. And this is basically like we're creating an internet that is all about supporting algorithms and not about supporting users and individuals and customers. I don't really have anything more to say than that. I think there are lots of other people who have a lot more like smart takes on it than I do. But I do think it's becoming more and more of a problem, right? What I've heard referred to as the enshittification of the internet is definitely happening, and you can see it across pretty much every platform, where if you're not like curating your own feed and you're not going and searching for your own videos and you're just letting the algorithm sort of take over and recommend stuff to you, it gets weirder and weirder and darker. And I don't know that we have a good solution for it. And it's something that I think designers need to step in and be the middle of. And I think, again, it's about empowering you to understand how these systems work, and then where you throw a wrench into the system, or say like, as a designer, I need to step in here and create a better system. And so this leads us to maybe talking a little bit about what are the future of these systems. A lot of these recommendation systems are actually quite old in terms of technology, right? They were built in the late 90s, early aughts. They've been improved upon. We've added more and more models on top of them. So now the sophisticated systems are like multimodal. They're doing lots of different things to make different recommendations. But what's the future? Obviously, like Gen AI has been the biggest thing over the past couple years. So I think you're going to see more and more people like move into those spaces. And actually, Nabil, thank you for sharing this. Nabil shared this article about how the Google Maps system is starting to integrate Gen AI into their system. And I definitely recommend you sort of read the article because I think it describes a little about what's going on here. But essentially, it turns Google Maps into something like a chatbot. And I have some questions about how realistically this is a chatbot. And I think the idea of this being generative AI is, I'll be honest, a little bit bullshit. I think, yes, it uses the chatbot function, but I think it's actually like using the chatbot to more or less break down what is essentially a search function, right? So it is using like semantic search or something similar to sort of make up new rules. And I could see a world where if I were to sort of like build the system myself, like you might actually tie Gen AI to help create better search results for your map system. So I kind of wrote out how I think this might work. They're not super clear on how it works, but I kind of wrote out a quick like sort of use case on how I think it works. And that would be something where the user talks to Google Maps. Google Maps talks to more of a generative AI system, say like Gemini, that being the newest Google version. Gemini then feeds search results back to Google Maps, and Google Maps then shows those results. Now, likelihood, there's like Google Maps has like some custom data being sent to Gemini alongside it. We'll cover more of this during next week, but what I imagine the conversation almost go like is a user says, hey, places with a vintage vibe in San Francisco. Now that's pretty ambiguous, right? That could be, I want to go to a concert that is in a vintage location, or I want to go shopping. So Maps would then talk to Gemini and say, like, what places are often described as having a vintage vibe? And this is where, a generative AI system might say, like, well, it's usually about record stores or thrift stores or flea markets. That then gives Maps a better idea of how to actually go and do the search results for that. So then Maps says to the user, like, here are a selection of stores with vintage vibes, record stores, thrift shops, flea markets. Now, this is where a user might say, I didn't mean stores, I meant lunch places. So again, like Maps then needs to figure out like, oh, okay, vintage vibe, lunch places. Let me talk to my generative model to see like what's happening there. And this would be like what kind of restaurants are like this. It could be old restaurants. So maybe, Maps has a way to search old restaurants. But Gemini may also say like, well, that's just diners. Like, find a vintage diner in San Francisco and their location, and that's what you show. In which case Maps would say like, here are nearby diners. This kind of reminds me a little bit of what Keelan was talking about when she was talking about the poetry camera, right? Which is like you kind of are chaining a couple different models together to produce something that is either unique or gives you better sort of like a diversity of options, right? So in the case of poetry camera, you take a photo, the photo gives a description, the description is converted into a poem. In this case, it's more like you're kind of giving a little bit of feedback to the model. It's sort of chatting with you while also sort of using this to do semantic search and to figure out like a bunch of different things about the model. Now, I should also mention here, there's probably likely some step where Gemini or whatever generative model is also being fed all the custom data from Maps, right? So Maps might have descriptions of restaurants or descriptions of stores, and it might actually be looking up based on those descriptions and might be doing semantic search. And we'll talk a little bit more about semantic search next week. I do have a video on how to do that. I'm actually just share this week since we don't have a lot of material to cover. So if you are interested in sort of understanding a little bit how semantic search works, we can look at that. And then obviously if you're interested in this, like next week we'll be doing a lot more discussion around LLMs, large language models. So it's likely that no system in the future will be using just collaborative filtering. I mean, most of these big platforms today are not even just doing collaborative filtering, right? They're adding in natural language processing based on all of the data that a record label provides on a song, or they are scraping and listening to the track, the soundtrack or speech track in a video and then applying that, or they're just looking at the pacing of a song or whatever it is. So reality is like more people are probably already using these sort of multimodal systems. And we'll just see more and more of that. I think generative AI will also become like a bigger part of these tools because it's easier to do stuff like semantic search or maybe even do more chatting with a customer to actually understand what they're really interested in and not just rely just solely on their search terms. So that covers everything we're going to talk about this week. Again, pretty short week. So, I think it's more about getting a feel for these systems and beginning to think about how they work. This will obviously influence the next week of LLMs and then the week after on image generation. So I hope you look forward to those weeks. Again, ask me questions in our Slack channel about ideas or concepts in here. Maybe you've seen some products that are already doing stuff like this and you want me to think about breaking those down. I'd be happy to do more breakdown videos if there's cool products we should be looking at. The challenge with some of these is like the user side of things is always somewhat less interesting than say the actual like technical details or what's going on behind the scenes. But if you do find a really cool model, I don't know, maybe people are like uploading videos or uploading images and then doing a semantic search on those images to find other locations that look like that. That'd be pretty cool. Maybe Google Maps needs to build something like that. So if you do have ideas on those things, like please share them. I'm happy to record little videos and share that with the group as well. Yeah, so that's it for this week. Next week we'll be looking at LLMs, which I think will be really fun. So until then, I'll see you next time.